second in our series of our each meeting is focused on a little bit different. So last meeting we focused really on kind of the projects, and this evening we're going to talk a lot more about kind of the financial responsibility of the city and the financial impacts. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan Davis.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Appreciate your time. I know some of you attended the first one. We're going to start tonight by giving a little bit of a introduction of staff. I'll introduce staff here in a minute, and then we'll do a brief project overview. We will talk about kind of the economic considerations, both in terms of the kind of current economic setting and the project financial overview. And then we'll talk about funding options, and we'll have some time for Q&A actually throughout the conversation. So let me just start off. We have several staff who are going to be involved and present tonight. We have Morgan Walton, and Morgan is in our one of two acting finance directors, and she's going to join the conversation tonight. And then we have Alex Nelson, and Alex is also going to participate. He's assistant to the city manager. And then we have Debbie and Natalie, who are both in our communications team, and you saw some of our IT folks too. And then we also have Maddie, who is with our kind of consulting financial consultant group. So she has helped us with some of our financial analysis and our kind of projections around the financing for these projects. So lots of support and lots of work gone into these projects to get to this stage, and we're really kind of just at the beginning, which is why we're here tonight, is to start to get some input and feedback from the community on these potential projects and this potential opportunity and option for the community. So we are looking at 3 projects for potential development and renovation. The 3 projects that we're looking at are the Recreation Center, the BDRC, and this is for a renovation and expansion of the existing facility, and it would expand and enhance the aquatic center, also the fitness center, older adult programming, so add on a space for senior programming and other services for community members of all ages. Also for a new civic center on South Public Road, just north of here, and it would be basically replacing this City Hall building to provide a more accessible and welcoming public building that would be more of a civic center. So it would have a little bit more kind of interactive, accessible community space for people to have meetings, for people to interact and engage in local government activities, as well as the services that we provide, and also to house staff and government services. And then the third one is our service center. You probably haven't been there before. You can see on the map that it's further east on South Boulder Road. And this is where we have many of our city services with public works, parks, open space. We have a lot of maintenance that happens out of those buildings. We have our operations, our public works operations that happen out of those buildings. So everything from kind of street maintenance, open space maintenance, park maintenance, that's where kind of the hub of all of those, like the equipment, the fleet, so the vehicles, our mechanics are there, all happen from that facility. We identified these 3 projects through kind of an extensive assessment project or process where we looked at all of the city's facilities. The city has really more than 30 plus actual facility buildings that we maintain, and that doesn't include things like kind of like water buildings that house just like a pump station. It's actually facilities that we have to maintain. And we assessed all of our facilities and looked at the age, the condition, sort of the systems, the infrastructure, how they're utilized, the future needs of those facilities for the city, and identified these as the top priorities for making investments to better serve the community. And so these are the 3 that we are here to talk about tonight. We did, through that assessment process, we did some initial costing. So really just kind of preliminary costing around what it would look like to develop these projects. The Recreation Center and Civic Center would both be approximately $34 million, and the Service Center approximately $6 million. So in order to move these projects forward, it would be about a $74 million investment. And if we move forward with a debt service model, it would be about just under $6 million a year, so $5.9 million of debt service required for a year. And that's looking at a 20-year bond issuance. So these projects were all kind of identified through the lens of our strategic outcomes. So the city has these strategic priority kind of outcome areas, and really some of the focus areas that we've been kind of thinking about are the excellent city services and infrastructure, and how we are able to currently maintain these facilities successfully, and really in kind of a fiscally responsible way. Which is to say, repairing and replacing expensive, aging mechanical systems, getting to a point of failure at systems, and kind of building infrastructure, and what those next steps look like, and what those investments look like, and what replacement looks like. We also want to have quality community amenities. So when we think about the rec center, we know that our community likes to have community spaces where they can interact and engage and have, kind of quality services. And then also, of course, we're thinking about environmental stewardship, connectivity, a sense of place, and all these other factors as well. So when we think about why now, it's always hard to, find the right time. And these buildings range anywhere from 30 to over 50 years. So they are all quite old. So we know that we're kind of, again, approaching end of life. But we also know that what we've seen in the past decades is that construction cost trends are obviously only going up. And so every year that goes by, the costs of these projects get more expensive. So if we wait a year, 2 years, again, we're really trying to weigh what those costs of sustaining and maintaining these buildings looks like, in kind of comparison to what replacement looks like over time, and what the cost of building it, say, in 5 years or 10 years would be. So we expect this to continue. Again, we don't know what's going to happen with the economy. We'll talk a little bit about that, but we do foresee that construction costs will likely continue to go up. And in Colorado, this is CDOT's construction cost index. We've seen that across the state of Colorado as well. This is from 2012. There's some fluctuations that occur from year to year, but in general, the trend line is increasing. So we also, when we were going through this process and conducting the assessments, just being in the very early stages of these projects and not having completed any substantial design at this point, just the conceptual and preliminary design, we wanted to get some ideas about what's happening in other communities on the Front Range with the construction and development of these types of projects. So we have taken a look at several other similar projects just to see kind of cost comparisons and what other communities are doing and getting for their investments. So a couple examples we looked at is Parker is in the midst of a town hall project, and that's 32,000 square feet for about $35 million project to be completed next year. North Glen just completed a city hall, 34,000 square feet for $32 million. Berthoud's Recreation Center, that was actually completed a few years ago, and that was a new build for $32 million. And Aurora had a much larger rec center and field house in 2023 for $42 million. So we feel like when we look at sort of comparable types of amenities, we're in kind of the right ballpark for what kind of investment we would need to be making to have these types of municipal services and amenities. We are going to next talk about funding options. And give you an overview of sales tax. But are there questions on what I just discussed before we move on?
Is the proposed spot for the Civic Center? Sure. The proposed spot for the Civic Center, you said just north of here. Is it in front of Morel's?
Yes.
Is that? Okay.
Correct. Yep. Where the dragon is now.
Yeah. Lovely dragon.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have questions about the Civic Center. Hi, Megan.
Hi.
What departments would be housed in the new Civic Center, and how does that differ from the current Civic Center? I know that's always been a challenge to have services sprinkled around, and so wondering how that might change. And people might be surprised to know how few are in this building versus scattered around. wondered what happens to this building and this space, and what the, if you have any information, this is, actually, I'll hold that question. I think I know the
I'll
answer.
start with the first one. So, question about who would be in the building. So, just first, I want to just, share for those who aren't aware, municipal services have changed significantly over the lifetime of this building. So if you imagine when this building was built, almost 50 years ago, even in the last 10 years, we've had more services like sustainability. There wasn't information technology at that time. Our planning and building services were not nearly as extensive as they are now. We didn't have transportation infrastructure staff, engineering staff. So municipal services have changed pretty substantially. So I would say the types of services that are available in this building have grown a lot over the course of the last few decades. Those services would all remain in the new Civic Center. And in addition, we would have the municipal court over there. So there would be a council chambers and then also a municipal court, a shared space. And that would be a shared space that could also be used as a community space. We also anticipate having more spaces where people can have kind of an interface with planning and building services, with engineering services, where we don't have a lot of those kind of engagement spaces or kind of community counter spaces where people can meet with staff who are leveraging or utilizing those services. So I think those are some of the main changes that you would see. And then with regard to this building, we don't know. That would be a conversation, a community conversation that would have to, we'd have to have about what would happen with this city asset and this building.
It is owned completely outright by the city.
Correct.
And including the parking lot, the parking around. And then what happens with the community or the court municipal court that's currently housed at the police department building?
Well, so, the kind of two public safety facilities that are there, the police and then fire station number 1, that space for court is kind of a multi-purpose space that they also use for training. And so both PD and I think fire use it also for meetings and for training. And so that's already, in demand for a kind of in-demand space for a lot of other purposes. And so that will be able to be utilized fully by our public safety services. And then courts would be separated from the PD, which is kind of a best practice around municipal courts, is to have it separated from the police department, which makes people feel a little bit safer, and it's a little less threatening when people are, having to engage with a judge around a ticket or, some other municipal court, activity. Yeah, we have two.
Well, I was going to wait, but since the door's already been opened on that question, so I was on the building committee for the police building that's currently in use, and was designed with the courts in it, because the courts used to be in City Hall, specifically because of security concerns, because you could staff from the police department that was in the same building. Now you're moving it out of the police building, it means you're going to have to staff it remotely, and that to me adds more cost and charges to the process. Plus, the police building was designed basically to be able to handle growth, so they didn't just build it for the existing size, they built it for built-in growth for at least into the 2030s. So I'm hearing this and I'm having a disconnect here, because all of a sudden you're going against the reasoning things were done in the first place.
I can answer that, Megan, because I think Frank, if you want to talk with Chief Basher, I think he would say that the growth has outpaced what they had planned for. So he is at the brim as well within the PD. So even best intentions, sometimes we recognize that things grow faster than they want. They also have outsourced the staffing of it, so it wouldn't add any additional cost. They do no longer use existing police department staff for it, so it would just shift the contractor from the police building into City Hall or into the municipal center.
Okay, so there's not a safety factor in terms of, somebody not happy with the court and deciding to go into the rest of the building and do some havoc there?
We had lessons learned here where the building was wide open. We would certainly make sure that safety is a priority regardless of whether the court is located there or not.
Okay, and I guess I just want to jump to one other thing here. You keep seeing statistics on this, and it doesn't seem to bother anybody, that statistics done on our road maintenance said we should be spending at least $2 million or over every year just to maintain our roads enough that they don't decay to a point where we'd have to replace them. Yeah, we're always allocating substantially less money every year, so shouldn't maybe we be bonding a fairly large amount for road maintenance to at least get our roads up to the point where they can be maintained on the budget we have?
Yeah, I mean, we had completed the multimodal transportation plan, and we have a plan for ongoing maintenance and meeting our kind of our road maintenance standards on a regular basis. Bonding isn't always the best strategy, really, for maintaining roads on that basis. It's on an ongoing basis. You want to make those investments so that you can continue to, over time, replace them versus doing everything all at once and then having to replace them, all at once. And so that's the strategy that we and most municipalities have around the kind of paving aspect of it. And then with regard to a lot of the other implementation measures and projects that were identified in the multimodal transportation plan, we are on a lot of shared corridors, so CDOT corridors and other regional corridors, and a lot of transportation funding comes from state and federal. We don't know what's going to happen with federal transportation funding, but it has typically been an area where we've been able to get funding for those corridors, and that's how we kind of prioritize those investments, is based on how we can plan for them, do the design, do all the engineering, and then get in the pipeline for that funding to complete them, again, on kind of scheduled, maybe, longer time horizon. So that's sort of the strategy.
So, I mean, we agree on the basics, but I guess you're missing the point that we're not spending what we should be spending now to keep the roads up to a certain level. And so you're telling me that you're going to rely on grants that you may or may not get to reach that number and help maintain the roads?
No, grant funding isn't for maintaining the roads. We budget every year. We use, basically our general fund dollars to budget through, a maintenance fund to fund the roads. That's how we fund those. But for big street crossing improvements, multimodal projects like a pedestrian underpass or a new pedestrian crossing that would require a lot of infrastructure, or a new bikeway, for example, those would be projects that we would want to work, with partners on for grant funding.
Okay, so I guess I'm sorry. I seem to be missing it here. When it comes to the basic maintenance, not building underpasses, fancy bridges, just the basic maintenance.
Budgeted through
And that
the
comes
general
from the general fund, but we're not meeting what was said to be the requirement for annual expenditures to maintain our roads. So what's going to happen?
I mean, we continue to, prioritize that as well as we can through our general fund prioritization process. I mean, we look at what's sort of in the pipeline for repaving every year, and we identify those that meet, are kind of due based on the pavement condition index, and we identify them, prioritize them, and that's kind of the pace at which we're making them. I mean, you can do it more quickly. It just depends on the appetite of council and community to increase those investments and decrease other investments in paving.
Okay. There's one last real quick question. What is the city reserve currently?
I would have to ask, yeah.
We'll let interim CFO, we do have at least 25 more slides, so I do want to be respectful of time, and certainly can have an offline conversation for sure. These are great questions, but we can get to that point maybe at the end of it once interim CFO has the opportunity to look it up. But
Someone else over here had a question?
I'll wait.
Okay. All right. You ready? Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Morgan. Talk about budget.
Good evening. So I'd like to start with an overview of the 2025 budget. So the total 2025 budget is approximately $121 million, and approximately 23% of that is allocated specifically to capital. So then looking at that a little bit deeper, in that 23%, approximately 84% of that is coming from our dedicated or enterprise funding sources, and that really means that they can just be used for very specific functions. This includes updates to our water treatment facilities, our parks, or our fleet replacement. And fleet replacement is the city vehicles that are necessary to provide services, so think park maintenance vehicles, police cars. The additional 14% that we have as part of this breakdown is supported by the general fund, and that's really supporting transportation improvements such as street repair, sidewalk repair, and then some of those one-time bigger projects like the bridge replacement, for example, on 120th over Coal Creek. And this leaves approximately 2% of that capital budget for the facility maintenance. So moving on to a little bit of a historical recap for facility maintenance. Historically, we have budgeted between $200,000 and $650,000 for this. This is really consistent with budgeting best practices, as facilities are not always the number one need to be filled. So some items that come first are going to include debt service, any operating or ongoing expenses for personnel, to make sure that we're providing the services to the residents. And so again, with that funding that's available, that is really going to routine maintenance, replacing any aging or damaged equipment. And then if there's anything left, it's for proactive maintenance, but that's usually some of the last items, just depending on how much we have available in that budget. To go through all of this, it really shows that the current capital funding sources are not sufficient to complete all the improvements that were discussed in the previous slides, which really brings us to how our capital projects funded at that point. So a couple different options, and we'll go a little bit further in depth on the next slide, but there are pay-as-you-go options, which are available annual cash flow revenues or any available fund balance. The next piece are financing tools. So if you don't have the pay-as-you-go options available, you're looking at something like a general obligation bond, revenue bond, or certificates of participation. So this is a pretty detailed table, but just to look at it at a high level, the first question we ask ourselves is, do we have revenue to annually support these debt payments? As we've discussed in other slides, the City of Lafayette currently does not have the revenue available to support this debt service. So then that really leads us to the right-hand side of this table of what are the potential financing options. And that is, as I said, we'll be going over a couple, but the first one we're going to be talking about is a sales tax revenue. So the current city sales tax is 3.87%. The majority of that is going to the general fund, that at 3%. That remaining 0.87% is split amongst dedicated funds, which are shown on the screen. So if you take this combined rate of the city's 3.87% tax rate, look at the state, RTD, Cultural District, and Boulder County, the total sales and use tax impact is 9.055%. So what that looks like on more of a visual scale is for every $1 of sales and use tax that is provided, approximately 44 cents of that is coming to the City of Lafayette. You can see that breakdown in the chart to the left. Approximately 34 cents of that is going directly to the general fund, and then split out against or to those dedicated funds on the other side. 33 cents of that dollar is going to the state of Colorado, and 11 cents Boulder County, an additional 11 cents RTD, and then the Cultural District approximately 1 cent. So this is comparative sales and use tax rates for other Front Range communities that are similar in size and kind of makeup as Lafayette. So as you can see, Lafayette currently, with our current sales tax rate, no change, is at the higher end and at the top of this graph. So looking at that, again, that's that 9.055% of sales and use tax. And something to note on this, the closer you're getting to 10% is really changing the type of economy you're looking to get in your environment. So the closer you get to 10%, that's more tourist-based economy. So that's Vail, that's Breckenridge. That's not how the City of Lafayette gets a majority of their sales tax revenue, so just something to consider there. Here's some information about what the potential sales tax increase looks like. For each of the different projects, we're estimating approximately $5.9 million would be needed in debt service. That requires at least a minimum of 0.85% of a sales tax increase. We say that's minimum because bases for sales and use tax can vary year to year. Your debt service payment is going to be pretty steady. That brings the new city sales tax to 4.72%, which would bring the total sales tax to approximately 9.90%, which again is closer to that 10%. Any questions on this area? We'll also be looking at other funding options for property tax up next.
So if we can briefly go back to the tax table
Yep.
with all of the columns.
Sure.
One of the things that's not on this chart that's been a challenge for the city of Lafayette is the gross sales that is applied to the sales tax. So there are organizations and cities that have significantly lower city or total sales tax that generate voluminous amounts of revenue because of the total sales dollar that's banked against the sales tax that's there. So this chart here for me is a part of the story, and as you indicated, as you start to increase the sales tax, you discourage high volume sales units to come into the city. People that might, open up a dealership that would generate maybe $100 million of sales in an annual year will look to other places that have lower sales tax gross applications. So, as you pointed out, this has got a two-edged sword to this piece. And my question is, what can we do to lower that sales tax? Because we if we can't lower the sales tax, we can't encourage other businesses to come in, and we're going to get into a sales tax division with Erie on King Super and a few other things, and those have terms on them. So can you speak to how we might influence this chart so that the total net dollars improve to the city?
Sure, and I think that would be obviously a holistic conversation of development within the city. What are we looking to attract? What is the makeup of the city that we'd like to look at? I can't necessarily speak to what happens if we decrease our amount of sales tax in one regard and have different areas come in, but absolutely something that could be looked at.
If this entire project would get approved, for $74 million, the bonds get issued and the $74 million comes in. I'm obviously oversimplifying. But if there's significant cost increases, how does that get dealt with? Because you're looking at materials, you're looking at labor, very possibly you're looking at supply chain, problems. What is the interest assumption on a 20-year bond?
Sure. So to speak to your first question about escalating costs, we have tried to account for that, at least on a preliminary basis, for kind of escalating the cost estimates we've received currently for these projects. So tried to expand it out a little bit, knowing exactly, as you said, deadlines can be extended, projects can change on different edges to kind of make sure that we're still getting the product that the community had voted on. So we have a little piece of that that's already been included, but it is a big conversation to know for this funding, everything that has been, kind of approved or preliminary, should this go forward, it's a conversation of if the expenses are more than that, what does that look like? We are limited if we've issued a certain amount of debt and the projects are coming in more. We don't necessarily have the luxury to come out and say, oh, we needed more, we're going to come back out and ask for more funding. That's not a possibility. It would be more of how do we manage those costs, again, looking at a larger picture of all the other costs that are within the city and what funding sources we have available at that time.
You recall what the inflation estimate is on an annual basis, for that $74 million?
I don't recall. I think it was
Okay, so Maddie Brodanovic with Hilltop Security. So the assumed interest rate for the bonds that are kind of making up these debt service numbers is 5%. If we were to do it today, we would assume it ends up at more like 4.5%. For those of you that have been paying attention, interest rates have been a bit volatile over the last month particularly. So the uncertain, what we want to do and sort of what we advise the city is to make sure that we're putting out a higher number than we hope, right? The hope is that interest rates come down and we're able to help the city execute a borrowing for less should it be approved by voters. But 5% is what we typically use for ballot questions for governmental entities as they're going to the ballot, just to provide that flexibility. As far as inflation rate built into the numbers, I don't know if you guys have that, but the one thing I will speak to is those funds can be invested, right? So your project funds can be invested. So there will be some earnings off of that could help buffer for some contingency, but that's obviously uncertain, again, depending on the interest rate environment at the time as those project funds are delivered and then the draw schedule and actual investments.
Thank you.
And obviously, I'm asking for estimates here. I don't remember, what is the city's current bond rating, and what would our bond rating become if the whole package went through?
Yeah, so I think we talked about that in one of the council presentations. The city doesn't have essentially a general credit rating right now, so you have...
It does. I remember the city used to brag about the fact that we had an A+ or a B+ or whatever.
On obligations, so if the obligations aren't still outstanding, they're not continually rated. So from a standpoint of actually, like, if the city were to go issue sales tax bonds or general obligation bonds right now, that credit, there is a GO bond outstanding in the AA category. So we would still assume that would be the case. We've done some preliminary analysis for the city on what the impact would be for this if it were to pass and then the bonds were issued. And that impact is really minimal because you essentially have the revenues that are then going to support the obligation, right? So you have the taxing authority or what have you to then levy the revenues to then pay the debt service. If you were talking about doing like a COP as an example, which is repaid with subject to, annually available revenue, subject to appropriation, that's a different consideration from a credit perspective because they're looking at your existing revenues as opposed to voter authorization where you now have revenues available to support the debt. So we would still anticipate in that AA category.
I can pass it off to Alex.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Alex. I'm assistant to the city manager, and I'm fighting a bit of a scratchy throat, so please bear with me this evening. But next, we're going to talk about property tax as a revenue option. So before we even dive into this, I do just want to kind of set some context. And property tax is admittedly, I think, a little confusing. In Colorado, when we're talking about property tax, we're talking really about what's called a mill levy, which is each mill is $1 of tax per $1,000 of assessed value on property. And so each year the city does adopt a mill levy as part of the budget. And for 2025, our mill levy is 15.87. And that includes two specific earmarks for service areas within the city. And the first is a 4.5 mills for ambulance and fire services, and then an additional 2 mills for general public safety services. And as you'll see more in a couple of slides, Lafayette's really unique in that we are really one of two true full-service municipalities in the area, meaning we provide, as a city, all the municipal services that our residents rely on. Think everything from police, fire, emergency medical services, recreation, libraries, etc. But when we think of property tax, people understandably often associate it with school districts and the county, and that makes sense because for each dollar of property tax collected for property within the city of Lafayette, about over half of that goes to the Boulder Valley School District, just over a quarter of it goes to the county, and then we are the third highest collector within the city, and we get about 18 cents per dollar of property tax that's paid. Of that 18 cents, about 11 goes to support our general operating, and then 0.5 or 5 cents goes to those two earmarked service areas I talked about. So that's, again, the general public safety and then the fire and ambulance services. And then we do have one more year of outstanding general obligation debt service for the Great Outdoors Water Park, just over here on South Boulder Road. And so right now that's about 2 cents that's used to pay for that debt service. I mentioned we're unique in that we are a full-service city, and wanted to provide a bit more context about that. So you'll see a similar kind of flow of information to what we just went through with the sales tax component. But here, this chart's really looking at the entire property tax that's levied on properties to provide the whole suite of municipal services. So again, we provide all of them for our residents, but we are unique in that really every other city listed on here, which is again kind of a survey of similar cities either in the area or along the Front Range, they typically rely on additional special districts to provide services. So think the most common is fire service. So as an example, City of Louisville, to our neighbor, they have the blue bar, the blue portion of each of these bars is the mill levy that's assessed for the city's general fund. And then anything orange on top of that is what's additional for a special district to provide a service that the city also provides. And so again, using Louisville as an example, they have a mill levy for the city of about 6.5 mills, and then an additional mill levy of about 10.5 for the fire district that supports their residents. And so this is to allow us to kind of compare apples to apples in terms of the services that are being provided with property tax for the municipal service areas. And you can see here we're about the top of the bottom third. It's kind of close in that little range there. I want to touch on the anticipated or potential costs in terms of property tax this time. So again, similar table and formats to what you saw before. The projects on the left, $5.9 million of total estimated annual debt service. But again, I mentioned property tax is a little confusing, and so we've kind of provided 2 different scales or different ways of looking at it here. So the first on the 2 columns from the right is the potential tax increase per $100,000 of residential assessed value. And so that's for all 3 projects would be about $48 per year per $100,000 of assessed value. But in Colorado, the state legislature recently has passed a number of bills that have introduced and imposed value adjustments that effectively reduce the total value of the total assessed value before property tax is applied. So in order to factor that in, for a different way of looking at this, we, on the far right column, looked at the average house price of a house in Lafayette, $685,000, and then we're able to apply that actual value adjustment, which is a reduction of $55,000, to get at about a $300 per year increase in terms of property tax for these 3 projects. Zooming out a bit, though, as I shared at the beginning, we are not the only entity that collects property tax in the city, and so we wanted to kind of look at the total property tax bill for that average home within the city. And so the column on the left shows the average home, again, $685,000 within Lafayette, and what the current property tax bill would look like. So working from the bottom to the top, in blue you see the school district was the biggest portion, followed by the county in orange, Lafayette where they're green, and then there's 2 slivers on the top, both for the water district and the flood district. And then on the right, you can see what that spread looks like if all 3 projects were advanced and approved on the ballot and the property tax increased about $300. And finally, here's that same chart of the region, but this time showing where we would fall if these were advanced and approved by voters. And this would put Lafayette right about the middle of the pack in terms of municipal service mill levies. Before turning it over for any questions and next steps, I do just want to touch on, we are consistently throughout all of this looking at and will continue to look at other funding sources, most predominantly grant funding. Grant funding is a bit of, there's some fluctuation right now, some uncertainty, but generally the state, through their Department of Local Affairs and Colorado Energy Office, do have grants available to agencies like ours to provide funds, at least for specific portions of these projects that might be eligible, generally related to energy efficiency improvements. Similar, Xcel Energy can provide grants, and then we'll continue to look at any other sustainability, green building, or energy efficiency grants. And then kind of the biggest variable is with the multi-decade time horizon of these projects, it is possible that the city's financial position might change. Say if we're constantly assessing our fees, and should our fees change to better recover costs, that might change the way our general fund looks, or our overall financial position, as well as any unanticipated revenue growth maybe many years down the road. And so that is something that could be considered down the road on these projects. And so pause there for questions, and then we'll wrap up with some next steps. Yes.
So I have 3 questions. First
Okay.
question is, at 290 or so valuation of a $685,000 home, that looks to me to be about a 10% increase in the property tax on that property. Have you got a number for that? In other words, a $685,000 house today pays about $2,900 in property taxes, total property tax for the year. And we're talking about a 10% increase to property taxes after residents have already incurred a significant increase to property taxes. So do we have that increase? Because our property taxes have increased significantly in the city in the last 3 years. What are those numbers? So there's the current property tax for an average home at $685. And if we look at the taxes paid on that home 5 years ago, we would see that number would be down to probably under $3,000.
Oh, I see. Yes, yes. So to your point, yeah, the bar on the left is showing the
Current.
the current tax bill for the average home. So that is just over $4,000. I don't have the data, and I don't know that we do for looking.
Well, I have the data for
historically.
my house, and I can take a look at that chart, and I can tell you that the average house, if we looked at an address that was at 685, and we looked at that property tax 3 or 4 years ago, we would say, I would confidently tell you, it may not even be over $2,500 because the assessed value of houses went up.
Right.
BVSD had their large property increase. We saw an increase in the Boulder County. And so all of those things compounded the taxes to the homeowner. So it looks like a small number, and it also assumes, do we have any idea what the forecast is for the county in terms of their property tax? Because they're having financial issues.
We don't have.
No, yeah.
We don't have
Okay.
any assessment numbers or anything, yeah.
So I'll just kind of go back to the point that she made. We're in an economic environment in which we're seeing volatility on Treasury bills like we have never seen in the history of the Treasury bill. We're seeing volatility in both earnings, and one of the other factors that's sitting out there is Lafayette and the general Denver area has a number of federal and state employees that are being impacted by reductions in grants and grant fundings. And so the only thing I want to point out here is that a little visibility here and being able to answer questions about the changes in property tax and volatility over what those numbers might look like would be very helpful.
Yeah, we don't know anything about what the property taxes are gonna look like. We did recently see a presentation from CU Rich Wolbekind, and it's probably gonna be out there pretty soon, but, we are seeing that the home price in Colorado and specifically in Boulder County has decreased significantly. So Colorado, in its position, it was within the top 10 of the United States for many, many years. And now in last year, it was more like 35. And we are like in position of 35, and we're seeing Boulder County down in the bottom 10. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not still growth. I mean, we were seeing, 7 to 10% growth, and it was now, I think, like 2% or something. So we don't know what that's going to look like with property taxes. We don't know if next year the General Assembly will do something once they see, what reassessment looks like. Yeah. So those cycles happen, and then, the General Assembly responds if they need to, and the mill levies float and fluctuate.
I think one thing I'll just add on the general obligation bond front is, and this has happened with the city's outstanding bond and mill levy, is as property values grow, that mill levy is going to decrease. So what you're essentially sizing that mill levy to generate that 5.9 or whatever $1 million of revenue it ends up being every year. So while unfortunately the other mills don't really do that, the bond side does. And so it sort of should hold you constant of what you're paying per year as it relates to the bond. Unfortunately, not anything else, but it does insulate you a little bit on that front.
I feel like maybe I missed an introduction slide. Are we talking about an either or in terms of property tax increase or sales tax increase? Or are we talking about both of these things being proposed?
It's a good question. They're generally looking at either or. That decision has not technically been made, but generally looking at either or. Yeah, we're still in the exploration piece.
What do people think about these?
Yeah.
I just wasn't clear if that was both or either or.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good clarifying question.
Alex. Alex, simple question. You said earlier that Lafayette is one of two municipalities that fully fund. What's the other one? Is it Longmont, or can you say?
Yes and yes. I can say it is Longmont, and even then there's an asterisk. You'll see there, it's in very small print, but Longmont actually contracts their EMS as well. So we are, in terms of true full service, we are really the only one up on this list.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
It might be helpful to share what, and hi, Alex. It might be helpful to share what major capital projects the city has had in the last 10 or 15 years. We have put ourselves in a really good financial situation for maintaining, and now that we've had a lot of growth over that time, we haven't necessarily, in my opinion, invested in the capital improvements for a city and a city that's going to continue to grow, and to the point where we would be at complete build out. And so I think these capital projects are really important to add value to the city, but it is, concerning how a sales tax would stack on top. I know that the city council has always been aware of approaching that 10% marker and being on the higher end for the communities around here. So I think kind of knowing and sharing what other capital projects have happened would be helpful. And also knowing the history of what the city has done for bonds. We have historically had several bonding projects and maintained a good balance for cash revenue and debt service that has put us in a good credit rating, and we've had a good rating in the past, but we haven't necessarily been exercising it a lot lately. And so knowing some of that history might help a potential ballot measure for people to understand that this is a regular way of funding projects and how this stacks on top of what we've already done and kind of where we are in that debt service ratio now versus in the past. Does that make sense?
I think so. Let me try and you tell me. Yes, the city does has historically done a good job of managing the debt issuance and debt service. And the city has done a number of capital projects, specifically actually in the utility front, and those are all funded through enterprises which don't require the voter approval to issue debt. But for an example, we have the new water reclamation facility just on the east side of town. That was mid-$40 million bond issuance, debt issuance, capital improvement. There have been some transportation projects as well. South Boulder Road, 119th and State Highway 7 that's just wrapping up. So some of these larger capital projects have been done, and at the same time, as discussed earlier, we're working on also improving our general capital maintenance efforts, everything from transportation to facilities as well. And I feel like there was a part two, and I'm forgetting.
I think you kind of covered most of it. One other question I had kind of related to what Frank was bringing up regarding transportation. I'm wondering what, if as you look out and forecast, the city's revenue and additional capital improvements or maintenance projects, particularly as it relates to transportation. Don't forget that while there is a lot of money and the transportation planning has to use all of those colors of money that are out there, would would we ever be in a position where we would need to add sales or property taxes to complete the desired transportation projects in addition to the capital improvements, that are more structural and building kinds of things?
I don't know that I can speak to that with certainty, aside from kind of referring back to the earlier discussion about the ongoing annual maintenance activities, as well as the larger one-time grant opportunities. But let's see if there's anything else to
Those
add.
grant opportunities, have the local matching funds that are required. And I'm guessing, if there starts to be strain at the federal level, that matching fund might start to increase for the city. So would we, I guess it's just a really big question on how the city and how the council is prioritizing those transportation investments compared to, these significant capital improvements, all of which I think are needed and necessary to maintain the quality of life that we'd like to have in Lafayette.
Yeah. Hi, Stephanie. I'll answer a little bit about that with the tax piece of it. So we had in the past considered that, and as you can see, we're kind of at the max of our sweet spot as far as a 9%. So one of it would have to be a conversation with the community about reprioritizing where dollars go, and if there's different ways we want to reprioritize our dedicated taxes, which would then go to the voters. The other piece is that when we talk a lot about these large capital projects, we're talking tens of millions, and you can see that bringing our sales tax rate up to 10% but doesn't generate what a major transportation project would get in any given year. And so the tax might not be the right mechanism for transportation in particular, but certainly we're looking about that and prioritizing
Are you feeling comfortable with what you're seeing and forecasting in the next 2
I'm
to 5 years?
feeling not comfortable about anything. Is anyone feeling comfortable right now? No. Let me finish my question. Are you feeling comfortable that the money that you have in the general fund for maintenance can keep things, at the current, or even improve some of the quality when it comes to the transportation piece of? I think what we're going to need to have with council this, in future councils is that conversation, because it keeps us kind of at the baseline, right? As costs are escalating. And so we definitely need to start to talk about where those priorities lay, and something might have to give.
Stephanie just caused me to bridge into an interesting question. One of the ways that municipalities reduce risk, particularly on bond measures, is to ladder them so that you tier them, but you get one done, and then you do the next, and then you do the next. And back to Stephanie's piece about that, with the way that FEMA is changing, one of the issues that's becoming a real uncertainty for cities like ourselves are climate-related issues and that damage water facilities or other public buildings. So, back to your question, I'm going, oh, yeah, all you got to do is look at your property insurance, and it's about as volatile as the Treasury bill. So my question is, did we look at laddering the bond issue so that it had a tiered piece? You get phase 1 done, phase 2, phase 3, so you might approve it, but you approve it over a time that works to mitigate the risk for the uncertainty. So that's the reason I'm asking you that.
Yes, and I will let Maddie elaborate on that.
Yeah, so I don't think we've necessarily come to a decision on that at this point, but we have certainly looked at it primarily because depending on what the voters and the city and council choose to go forward with, particularly between the new city hall and then the recreation center, both of those are two really fairly sizable projects that it's unlikely that those are getting done at the same time. And so if both of those were to move forward specifically, we would likely ladder them just to have essentially a first issuance for one of the projects and a second issuance for the other. What that ends up looking like as far as a tax impact, though, is probably not changing, because if we were to sort of stair step up the tax increase, it just is going to increase your overall repayment for the city from a city perspective, and you're going to pay more interest. So essentially what we're trying to do is the more fiscally responsible thing by structuring the debt service essentially to assume that all of it's issued at once, if that makes sense. But so we'll leave like a step down in debt service basically to fill that in.
So here's the answer that I heard. Yeah, we've looked at it, but we'd like to reduce the overall cost, particularly the rent is, to lock it all in as a total piece. But that doesn't mitigate the other changes that we would find perhaps coming from city, from state, from other obligations and the piece. So it's a trade-off to say, yeah, we'll lock this one in, not knowing what the future is. So that's what I was really talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we can't, so, right, if, once the decision is made to go forward to voters, there are certain parameters that we have to put in a ballot question because of Tabor. So, and one of those questions is, how much is the city borrowing? And so that, I think goes back to some of the initial questions in the first section about, what are the assumptions that were built into that? And so if, the city is asking for, X amount of dollars, but by the time it comes to do the second issuance, right, for the second project, those project costs have changed, then that goes back to, I think, some of the answers that were already provided, that we can't lock in project costs 3 years before you're going to build something, right?
Most of my questions I've been asking as a 20-year member of the community, but I did want to share with you all, as the chair of the Senior Advisory Board in Lafayette, the Senior Advisory Board has briefly discussed and is aware of the project, and we'll be talking more about it because we definitely, as a group, are interested in understanding how other municipal facilities that commingle senior services and recreation services look and feel like, and what those pros and cons are, so that we can give, as a board, some feedback to the city. But there definitely is concern as our community continues to age, more and more people will be on a fixed income. And so I think that those are important things for the city as you're forecasting short, medium, and long term, to take into consideration the impacts that these have, these and future capital projects and budgeting will have on people in the community that are on a fixed income. Oh, and I want to add, on a positive note, I really am liking the opportunity of commingling activities of people for all ages at a rec center, and also continuing the fantastic programming that we have at the existing senior center. So if you all haven't checked it out, just amazing stuff, things for all kinds of ages and all kinds of activity and interest levels. So, and there's no age limit for being on the Senior Advisory Board, or you have to be 18, that's it. Or participate in the activities. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess as somebody who's lived in Lafayette for 26 years, I want to reiterate what Stephanie said in terms of the city has always been extremely supportive of the community needs in terms of services and being flexible there. So that's really important, and obviously, hopefully, will continue. But I wanted to ask about, you said that you built into your estimates, you built some I guess, something into it, if you will. And I guess worst case, considering that construction costs could either double, triple, or quadruple, depending on how things currently roll out, and city revenue also could drop 15, 20% easily. How much of all of this have you factored in as a worst-case scenario?
When we did our cost estimation, we factored in basically 4% annual escalation in costs, and then we did, soft costs, so sort of 25 to 30% soft costs. So there's some buffer in there. We did not look at doubling, or, we didn't look at any of those sort of catastrophic scenarios. We used kind of a.
And I would say, I think for the reason for that, we would not recommend to city council if we start to see doubling of that, or if we start to see decreases in revenues. I can't imagine we didn't even have that in the recession, but if we start to see that, that's not something we're going to recommend to council, right? So part of the reason why we're having these conversations so early is there's no foregone conclusion that we're doing that this year, that we're doing all 3 projects. We really want to get these inputs because, especially now, we recognize this might not be the right time, but we want to get in front of the community that these are needs and we will, the more we kick it down the can, the more expensive it gets. So it's just like, let's open up those conversations. So, if you do any sort of change management process, awareness is one of the first pieces that you want to do before you even get to the change, right? Or even get to the decision making. So, so I do want to be respectful that we are close to 7. We do want to talk next steps, but we will be here to answer other questions afterwards. But just for the benefit of our IT folk that are hanging out late this evening, I'd like to let them wrap up and head out. So I'll let Megan do the few next steps and then we can talk offline.
Yep. Just a couple more. Okay. So, as City Manager Doling mentioned, we're really still at the front of this whole process, and the process that I'm laying out on this slide, there would be many more slides in terms of these projects if they were to move forward. We have had initial discussion with council on a couple different occasions. They talked through the project prioritization with us and the financial analysis and scoping. They asked us to conduct some engagement and to kind of daylight these projects with the community and to talk to you and get feedback. So that's where we are right now. So we are just starting to wrap up actual community-wide statistical polling process that will give us data around the voters in the community and what the interest is in the projects, what the interest is in the financing options, and that'll be great information. Again, as Katie mentioned, whether the council decides to move forward or not at this point, it's just good to know what the interest is in these projects. And also, we'll report those findings to council along with the feedback that we are getting through these meetings at the end of May. And then council will make a decision either at that meeting or they might want further discussion. It would then have to go to the Council for Ballot Language Certification, and there would be more community outreach, and then it would be, if they wanted to go this year, it'd be put on the election for November 4th. They could also make a decision to revisit it next year. So there's any possible scenarios. And also with regard to the projects, as we've mentioned, we've only done preliminary conceptual design. So what you see in the boards outside, which I hope you have a minute to take a look, because we didn't talk a lot about the projects tonight, but you can see just kind of the concept designs and the schematics. Each project would have a design process ranging from 8 to 16 months, depending on how big the project is. And during that project, we would have community engagement as well. So people could say, I really love that therapeutic pool, and that's really important to me, or I really love the opportunity for pickleball there, or whatever that might be. And so there also would be engagement during that process so that we make sure that we're kind of incorporating what the desires are. So that's where we are now. We have one more community meeting, and that topic is going to be around environmental stewardship and sustainability. We have a survey, so whether or not you got called for the polling or got a text for the polling, you can also take our survey. That QR code will take you to the survey. You can also go to our website /Capital Bond, and you can take the survey there. The city council meeting will be on the 27th of May, and then you can direct questions as well to communications@lafayetteco.gov. So thank you so much for taking the time tonight to join us. We really appreciate all the questions and your thoughts and input. We have sticky notes outside, and we have some questions. You can answer the prompts of the questions, or you can put other thoughts on a sticky note and put it up there. We're going to capture all that, and that will all go back to council as well. So thank you very much.